This episode of The Seminarian is sponsored by Asbury Theological Seminary. Hey guys, quick note about this episode. This was actually the first episode that Joe and I ever recorded, but we didn't release it right away. You're going to hear about why Joe and I chose to enroll in seminary and a little bit of the history of how we got here. When we first started The Seminarian, we didn't think that people would be interested in hearing some of our backstory until further into the season. And now, the time has come. Hope you enjoy listening, and thanks for being here. It was like a drug deal. They'd pull up to the house, and I'd be like, thank you for your support. And I'd help move this tote of toilet paper into their... But yeah, that was our missionary career.
Seminarian. Noun. A student in a theological seminary. Duh.
Hey everyone, and welcome to The Seminarian, where we talk about seminary life, theology, and the things that form us as Christians. I'm Josh.
And I'm Joe. And guess what?
What?
This is our first episode.
Dun, da, da, da.
In this episode, we answer the question, why did we choose to pursue a seminary education? In other words, why seminary?
Yeah, we'll give a snapshot of our own personal stories, our ministry history, and ultimately what led us to enroll at Asbury Theological Seminary.
What has brought us to this point?
A lot. The short answer is a lot.
A lot.
But I was just thinking for maybe some of our listeners, you may have been on the fence about pursuing a traditional seminary education. And what our hope is that as we tell our stories, we're going to try to pause and provide a value or insight that might be relevant for you, the listeners.
Right. We're hoping that you really relate to our story, that you might find yourself in our story, and it would spark more interest in pursuing seminary.
Yeah. It also maybe gives you a little context to who you're listening to and kind of our lives. Well, just as we get started, back in the third grade, no, I'm just kidding.
Going way back.
Yeah,
way
yeah,
back.
yeah, yeah.
I was 2 years old.
Right.
And I felt called to seminary. No.
But maybe we should kind of talk about our upbringing, like in a sentence. We both grew up in conservative evangelical communities. That probably is...
That sounded so boring.
Well, yeah, I was just about to say that a lot of people probably can relate to
Right.
that. Growing up inside church, serving in
Right,
churches.
yeah.
And so that was certainly my life. And I had this idea, seminary is where you go if you want to be a pastor. And it's like the next level of Bible school. And we did end up attending Bible school.
Right.
Both
Right.
you and I, Joe, we went to the same one up in Michigan.
Yep. Small Bible school, roughly 200 students. Maybe.
It was called New Tribes Bible Institute at the time.
Right.
Now it's called Ethnos 360. So it was basically this like small, unaccredited missionary prep school
Right.
with a larger organization that, again, they changed their name. It used to be New Tribes Missions.
Right.
But now it's Ethnos 360.
Mm-hmm.
And they specialize in sending missionary teams to indigenous unreached people groups. Think like Papua New Guinea, out in the tribe, real Jim Elliot type of stuff. And so we had both felt the call to missions. Man, I'm trying to think back when that was. That was like 2009, something like that.
I think 2008, 2009, somewhere in that range.
I just remember distinctly being in your parents' basement where you were living at the time, and we were just praying in earnest, God, use our lives for your glory, like whatever you want. If you had complete control of my life, like I say you do, and I sing songs on Sunday that you do, but if you really did, where would I go? And I felt very strongly, we both did, that the Lord would have us go to the unreached people groups.
Yeah.
And so we started pursuing that. And so we went to New Tribes Bible Institute. We had
remember packing up my little Honda Civic.
Yeah, totally.
And to the brim. Like couldn't even see out the back window.
80% of it was my stuff.
That's true. You had lots of shoes.
Yeah, and jackets. And
It was some crazy idea.
What was crazy
Move
too
halfway across
is we were trying to do Acts 2:42 before it was ever even popular. I remember you had no clothes.
It was popular in the first century, dude.
Well, okay. But before like churches started making that kind of their name brand, I remember I was like, dude, I have so much clothes, and you don't have very many clothes. We'll just share the same clothes. We're roughly the same size. We'll share the same laptop.
Yep.
Remember?
Yep.
You didn't have a
I
laptop.
brought a laptop.
I was like, we'll just split our homework time and we'll both do it. We'll be in the same classes anyway. And like day one, we get to the Bible college and the dean of the college is like, you're doing what?
What are you guys thinking? Yeah.
You're sharing clothes. You're sharing your computer. Like, no, this is not going to work. We're like, Acts 2:42.
I just remember walking away from that thinking, that's a great start. You know,
Yeah,
like
great impression.
First impression. Like,
And we're
oh,
still
man.
sharing clothes in seminary.
Yeah.
No, okay,
Yep.
we're not doing that. So New Tribes, their curriculum, I remember, had a lot to do with Moody Bible College, right? So they kind of came out of that same block of theology,
Right.
cut from the same cloth there. And so it was distinctly dispensational.
Right.
And what I really remember, honestly, from that whole time was just hermeneutics. I'd never heard of hermeneutics before coming. And I remember I had 3 classes on it.
That was a big push for them.
And that changed my life.
Yeah.
Just a simple Bible college's hermeneutic class. Because in our circles, we went to the same church. I want to say there were people that really knew the Bible well, but they were not challenging biblical interpretation as much as would probably be warranted.
Growing up and going to like youth group, you really wouldn't hear much about like how to interpret the Bible. It was mostly just like you need to read your Bible. Oftentimes from a more of a devotional or even just a you need guidance in your life or how to live or something, which
Character
is not bad
development.
things, but they would never have really talked about how do you actually study ancient documents and interpret them in a way that's consistent with the original context.
Right. And so at the time, I had graduated high school and I was coming on staff at that church and doing youth ministry and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, man, if you're reading the Bible and the Holy Spirit tells you something, or at least you think the Holy Spirit's telling you something, that's it. Like you just heard from God and that's the correct interpretation. Fast forward, we go to Bible college and we're learning about hermeneutics and we're learning about authorial intent and the original audience's interpretation and just all of these things. And that was mind-blowing to me.
Right.
And the reason I mention that is because that really planted the seed for studying the Bible accurately and for progressing in that knowledge, pursuing a seminary education of like, I really actually want to know this book and I don't want to make interpretations up. I want to know what the Bible has to say. And so I think that that's a value for our listeners. If you are hearing all of these different interpretations of the Bible and you're like, which one is right? It seems like there are so many denominations, there's so many views or interpretations on them. I mean, to a certain extent, just find someone that bears fruit of godliness in their lives, who is a diligent student of the word, and have them help you through those passages. I think yet another way that we're all called to be Bereans, if you remember that story from Acts 17, is to study the word yourself. Like get in the Bible and really learn how to read the Bible.
Yeah. Yep.
And so that could be a great reason for why you would want to enter into a seminary. And that began for me, at least, at Bible college.
Right. Another aspect to Bible college at that time was they had a real push for the narrative of the Bible. So their curriculum would start from Genesis all the way to Revelation in order.
You went through every book of the Bible.
So you go through every book of the Bible.
Yeah.
And they had bigger classes and stuff, but that were more like thematic and stuff like that. But generally, you just go straight through the Bible. And they would connect the story for you in a lot of ways that was super helpful. It really opened up the scriptures in a whole different way than just like opening the Bible or, if you've ever like sat with the Bible closed and then you just like let it fall open and you point and you're like,
Bible
that's
roulette.
My devotional verse for the day. Bible roulette, right?
Yeah.
It's like way different to actually have a story. You don't pick up Lord of the Rings and do that. You don't pick up any normal book
Right.
we
Like
have
in
nowadays.
the middle of Return of the King or whatever.
You're going to be so confused. You'll be
Right.
like, who's this person? What's this? What does this have to do with anything? It's like you have to start from the beginning and read that story through. It really made the scriptures come alive for me personally. The whole big narrative scope of the Bible.
At the same time, we came from a charismatic, non-denominational church. We were 18, 19 years old. We leave that only to find that New Tribes Bible Institute was cessationist.
Right.
And dispensational.
Which cessationist means they believe that the sign gifts or certain gifts ceased after the apostles' time period, and
Right.
they're no longer a normative part of the Christian life or the church.
Right. So what are we talking about? We're talking about prophecy,
Right.
speaking in tongues,
Yep.
healing, words of knowledge, those kinds of sign gifts that they validated the message during that apostolic era because the Jews demand a sign, but then at the closing of canon that those things ceased.
Right.
Thus cessationism.
Right.
And that we have only part of the gifts that were listed in passages like 1 Corinthians 12 and so on. And so that was very different because our church was pretty conservative, honestly, on the charismatic side, but still, like, we affirmed a continuist view, which is that the gifts are for today, that they continued past that era. And so there was a lot of theological disagreement and recalibration that took place, which I also think was formative and valuable.
Yeah, it was definitely formative and valuable. I mean, it was my first experience going to like a school where you learn the Bible. So a lot of what they said was like, oh, they got it figured out, you know, like from either whether it's a dispensational view of interpreting the scriptures or the cessationists, which tend to go hand in hand. But as a young guy who didn't really know much, I, for the most part, bought into it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. What was funny is I really struggled with it. Then I got on board with it only to like really struggle with it again after I left Bible college. And it was difficult at the time, but it's so valuable because I think otherwise I would have gotten stuck in a theological echo chamber and not really been able to articulate why I knew what I believed or what was the kind of opposition out there for me to consider. I'd only believed it because it was modeled and patterned for me.
Right.
And I think that while I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad, I think the Lord does call us to more, though. I think we are pressed to know and to search these things out. And so New Tribes gave me that opportunity.
Right. Yeah, that was definitely something that was modeled. And I could still take with me is the need to really search the scriptures for the answers of these things.
Yeah.
Rather than just kind of buy into whatever your church's like stance is on it or whatever is popular.
Right.
You know, it's really a matter of what does the scriptures say and trying to seek that out, that Berean.
Yeah, and that's intimidating, I think, for those who might be considering going to a seminary or just leaving kind of their church's theology and progressing towards something more. There is a little bit, even maybe in your communities, a sense of like, oh man, but if you go there, your theology is going to change. And I don't know if we're going to lose something in that. Like you won't be as connected to our church's tradition or denomination or whatever. And I would say to that, there's kind of two routes you can go. First, you could most likely stay within your denomination's theological leanings or in that vein of theology. So let's say, you know, your church is Reformed. Well, there are plenty of Reformed seminaries that you can go to, and it is going to further that. And it's also going to help you articulate why they believe the things that they do. Yeah. You're still getting out of the echo chamber is what I'm trying to say in a way, because they are going to bring in opposing views. That's what any good seminary is going to do, is kind of let you know what's out there and why they landed on such an interpretation. If you're Baptist, there's lots of awesome Baptist seminaries. You know, if you're Wesleyan or Methodist, Asbury Theological Seminary has a deep history in that, or non-denominational. Asbury, I think, really tries to celebrate interdenomination and non-denomination. But regardless, I think it's really good to get outside of your own church or your group of friends to explore some of those things. And then another way is to actually go the opposite direction and go to a seminary that you know has an opposing view. Yeah. And that's for the exceptionally brave, but what you're basically saying is like, hey, if my belief system is going to be tested, this is a great way to expose its weaknesses and to try to shore up my theology in whichever way.
And I think it's important to not be afraid to interact with different views, whether it's theological views or just biblical interpretation. Not being afraid of that is really helpful to, one, strengthening your faith, but strengthening either your view or, like you said, testing it. Honestly, if it doesn't stand up, you know, was it real in the first place, sort of thing.
Right. And that's kind of not intentionally, but almost accidentally what happened to us.
Right.
Is we went from a somewhat charismatic church into a cessationist Bible school back into a charismatic Pentecostal
More
church.
charismatic.
And then, and we're going to get to this in a second, we joined a very charismatic missionary organization. And so it really did expose us to kind of the gamut of interpretation on especially the gifts, but things like all of these different lenses that you can view the narrative of the Bible and soteriology, which just means the doctrine of salvation. So it was, I'm grateful for it, but it did cause some freak out moments where I was a little worried, and my community was kind of like, "What are you learning?" And I think it's valuable.
It's easy to, when you're in a community is kind of specific in their vein of theology or tradition, to not realize that the world of Christianity and biblical interpretation and theology is actually huge.
Yeah.
And there's a massive spectrum of beliefs and such that's out there, that is worth interacting with.
And they're not heretics.
And they're not necessarily heretics.
It's like, I think when you first come into contact with theology that's different from yours, it's like, that can't be right.
Right.
That's not biblical. That's anti-biblical. And you have kind of that insecurity that makes you almost judgmental and critical of other theologies.
Right.
And of course, there is a clear line of orthodoxy, or, what would be kind of ecumenical or agreed upon theology. But I think there's a lot to explore out there and a lot to learn out there.
Right. And a lot of work to be done still for scholars. It's continually progressing or
clarifying.
New discoveries being made. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls were only discovered in the last century,
Right. Yeah.
And that has blown up a whole new vein of study and scholarship into the first century church and its historical context. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done, which seminary plays into that, because it actually allows you into that world of interacting with.
A front seat, really.
Yeah, kind of a front seat of like, what are the top scholars working through right now?
Right.
What are the ideas that are being explored and stuff like that?
And I could be wrong, Joe. Correct me if I am, but it does also seem like what comes through academia and the seminary world, the church in America at least, but I think even globally, it's a progression. It'll follow eventually, but it kind of starts first in the academy. And so you have, and we'll talk about this later on the podcast, but things like new perspective on Paul, for instance, as a theology that's really in its peak and prime right now in the seminary world and being discussed and evaluated and all of those things.
Yeah.
And it's starting to trickle into sermons and kind of the lay people in churches and stuff. But not really, not a ton yet. And I think that eventually that's going to become almost normative, probably, at least. Yeah, very, very popular, in certain circles especially. But it starts in seminaries. And so if that's something that interests you and you want to kind of be on, not in a prideful way at all, but like ahead of the curve where you it's not just being handed to you, you're actually learning and investigating it yourself first.
Yeah.
Seminary, I think, is the place to do that.
It is actually pretty exciting. It's a trickling down kind of thing where you have your top scholars who are studying like the historical context. They're dealing with like archaeology, they're dealing with manuscripts, and they're synthesizing that and making conclusions, and then that's getting passed on to commentators who are then commentating on the Bible, and then those commentaries get read by pastors, and that informs their theology interpretation as they're teaching the Bible, and then that ends up in the pulpit. And so there's a bit of a influencing that happens
Absolutely
as it goes. A lot of people don't even know that is a reality. It's a behind the scenes kind of thing. They just assume what the pastor's teaching is either common knowledge or just the word of God straight up, and not influenced by some sort of scholarly work.
And much of that they learned from seminary, from sitting in classes, from reading their textbooks, from engaging with these kind of thoughts that, again, I'm not saying it's exclusive to seminary, but that's that's where it happens. That's kind of the center of gravity of scholarship. Again, like you're saying, all of these amazing authors and scholars are bringing and synthesizing the best of what they know into a classroom. And what a privilege to be in those classrooms.
Yeah.
You know? So I think the value here, and we'll kind of move on to the next little bit, is that we can find ourselves in theological echo chambers. And while that's not, I'm not saying that you're ignorant, or it's just a thing. It's just we surround ourselves with people that sound like us and talk like us. And that's not a bad thing. That's how you build community oftentimes, is finding commonality. It's also very valuable to go outside of that and be exposed to more, because something might hit you, like we're about to talk about, that like is life-changing, and you're like, holy cow, I could have missed this, and this changed my relationship with God. It really changed the way I read the Bible or whatever.
Right.
And so I would say explore and get out there and really see how the Lord uses that in your life. And so that's what happened to us. I think the next chapter of my story and Joe is that we took a scouting trip to Southeast Asia, to an unreached people group where we'd been thinking about going for a long time, and made the decision, we got to do something with this. And so by this time, I'm married. I've got, 3 kids, I think, at this time.
Mm-hmm.
You were still single at the time.
Yep.
And so we joined this organization called the Antioch Center for Training and Sending, or ACTS for short. And they were very charismatic, had a high emphasis on prayer, intercession, and on unreached people groups. And they really pushed things like the gifts, I remember you and I had some good conversations about like, whoa, what do we feel about this?
Right. I mean, it was kind of shocking going from cessationist Bible school to charismatic, like speaking in tongues, words of knowledge, and just like the whole gambit. Very charismatic worship services. And we're just kind of like, what is this? Like, I hadn't grown up with that, you know, and it was
the same.
It was a whole different world.
It was funny. I think our attitudes were even more arrogant at that time. I think at New Tribes, we were like, we don't know the Bible. Clearly, we don't know the Bible. Teach us your ways. Here now, though, it was like, we do know the Bible, or at least we thought we did.
Yeah.
We're like, I've been to Bible college. And not only that, I've been in ministry.
Yeah.
And so we just had very strong opinions about it.
Yeah.
But then they started teaching the Bible. Their Bible teacher was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And that was probably, again, that's one of those things I praise God. Like, if I would have missed out if I didn't get to have some of their Bible training in their missions training program, which lasted what, like a year or so?
Yeah, the whole thing.
And so what were some of your key learning points or things that you think were of value that helped wanting to do seminary later because of what we experienced at the Missionary Training Center?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the Bible teacher, he was phenomenal. And there was things that we would learn from their teaching there that was like, wow, I'd never realized that. It just made me want to like, oh, wow, if that's true, what else have I missed? And I wanted to dig deeper into it. And then another element too is just that the way that it was taught, the way that the Gospels were taught, it just made you like love Jesus. Like,
amen.
Just really want to know him. You know, you're like, I want to know him like that, you know, is inspirational in that sense.
Yeah.
To like really stir up an affection for Jesus and his word and just wanted to dive into it.
It was kind of the pairing, which was funny too, because again, we came in with these kind of judgmental attitudes of like, this is so showy, you know, this is so expressive or whatever.
Right.
But then once we kind of saw the fruit, we're like, these people are so godly. They're praying all the time. They're selling everything they have to go to the mission field.
Very genuine.
Yeah. And so
they're smart too. It's not like they're just buying into it sort of thing. You know, it's like these people know the Bible really well.
Yeah.
Like, and they've read up on it. They're not just repeating so-and-so. These people have like lives with God.
Yeah. Way smarter than me, you know?
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it was that kind of fruit, that combination, honestly, of passion and zeal.
Yeah.
But at its foundation was biblical literacy and just understanding the biblical narrative, the worldview, and that expressed itself in that community aligning their values for what I think God values. Yeah. And so it was kind of in a way, the full package, because you're like, wow, I don't love people as well as they do. I'm not as godly as them, and I don't know the Bible as well as them. And so you're right. I think it was very inspirational. And I think what that put in me was a sense of like, I want to be that.
Yeah.
I want the love that they have for God and for others, but I want to be that example and that model to others to stir up affection for Jesus. I want to live for his glory, or I want to inspire people to do great things for God.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was such a precious and sweet time for us. Yeah.
And it was really transitional too from the whole from the theological camps of like cessationism to charismatic, is having to wrestle through that for me. What was cool was that the way I wrestled through it wasn't like, oh, like they just are really loving people or whatever, I'm just going to go along with what they're doing. You know,
Yeah.
What it did was it really drove me to study the scriptures, to seek it, be like, okay, they're demonstrating these gifts, right? And it's like, okay, if it's from God, like it's got to be in the Bible, you know?
Yeah.
I was like, it's got to be there. If it's not there, then, it's not there. But it was like, I have to seek the scriptures. I have to go back to the scriptures to know. And it was in the studying of the scriptures that brought me to the realization that I think I was wrong.
Wow. I remember those conversations, by the way.
Yeah.
Digging into 1 Corinthians 1 or something like that for the gifts. Yeah, those were cool times. And then we both got on staff with that organization. You ended up going to China.
Yeah. Yep. I was there for a little over a year.
Yeah, doing missions on a team in China. And I stayed behind in Colorado Springs, and I ended up leading one of the missionary training schools that they did. And I was able to sit under some of the Bible teachers there. And it, again, just was like, wow, I have so far to grow. Like, I'm not even close. Like, there is so much for me to learn.
Yeah.
I have to start now. And so that just really impressed upon me. I can't be satisfied with what I know. I really have to go to a seminary or something like that.
More training.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yep.
But at that time, the goal was to get on the mission field.
Yes.
And so what we ended up doing was I raised up a long-term team to go to Southeast Asia. And anyway, we get there in January of 2020. What a time.
Yeah. And the rest is history.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally in the textbooks.
Yeah. So we sold all our possessions, said goodbye to family, thinking we're going to spend the next 20 years over there or whatever. And we spend like 3 months.
3 months.
Yeah. And essentially COVID breaks on the news. We hear everybody back in America is like running out of toilet paper.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have to tell this really funny story about
This is a good one.
toilet paper. So all of my family is like, we don't have toilet paper. We've just been using, like regular construction paper, whatever it was.
Man.
And I'm like, well, I'm coming back. And there's plenty of toilet paper here. In fact, people in our country that we were serving, they were buying toilet paper. They started buying toilet paper in mass, even though, they were asking us like, what do I do with this? Do I like wrap my body in toilet paper? Like, does that prevent COVID? Because they don't even use toilet paper on the daily. They just...
Context, they have a bidet.
Yeah, they do.
They have the like hose that they use.
And their left hand when they need to.
And their left hand when it's necessary.
Yeah. But they don't use toilet paper. And yet, even in these countries, they're just buying toilet paper. So I remember we're always very grateful to our missionary supporters. So we have to take a pit stop in Thailand, in Bangkok. And I go and I buy as much toilet paper as I can. I filled, I think, like 6 or 7 suitcases or totes full of toilet paper. And then when I land back in the States, I'm like, who is my biggest supporter? Oh, they gave me $100 a month. Like, I'm giving a whole case of toilet paper to them. And so it was like a drug deal. They'd pull up to the house and I'd be like, thank you for your support. And I'd help move this tote of toilet paper into their, but yeah, that was our missionary career.
Yeah, there we go.
Was COVID.
At
least the first part. So we landed back in the States very confused, like, oh my goodness, we just launched and now our whole team and our whole organization is falling apart because it's losing funding and just crazy stuff like that. And shortly thereafter, I ended up coming back on the staff at Springs Church, and you ended up marrying the other teammate.
Ooh la la.
my sister-in-law, my
Yeah.
wife's sister. So now we're brothers. In law.
Yeah.
We have sister wives.
We have sister wives.
If that makes that's probably a different terminology, but we're brothers. So that's great. And then I mean, I got into the trenches. Can you imagine being the executive pastor of a church literally at the onset of COVID, which was crazy.
Yeah.
So that doesn't, I mean, it does have something to do with theology. Obviously, everything is theological at some level, but that did not feel like ministry really in a lot of ways. That just felt like crisis management.
Put out fires the whole time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was
Yeah.
just emergency after emergency. Things are changing rapidly, church attendance, all of that type of stuff. So I got very well acquainted with that whole world, and it felt like seminary and theology stuff was just like never going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that this is another pause moment because sometimes we can get so wrapped up in, well, church life or just the fires and emergencies of life that those things feel like just a bygone dream that is totally impossible now.
Like you missed your opportunity, you know?
Yeah, or like it just doesn't have any relevance. Like, why am
Yeah.
I going to learn about theology when my plate is totally full with family and work and just all this craziness?
Right.
And to that, I would just say, in some ways, you're kind of right. Not that theology is impractical, but you just have to deal with what the Lord puts in front of you. And so I think that there are seasons for that. But in other ways, I almost feel like there will always be fires.
Yeah.
And there'll always be emergencies. And there's never going to be a convenient time to like stop your life necessarily
Right.
and go do seminary.
Yeah.
And yet I think that that is something that, you know, should the Lord impress that upon your heart, that we take seriously. Because if we're always driven by need, that's what I learned from COVID. If you're always driven by need, that rarely actually lines up with God's plan to just have your life dictated by need and urgency, you know?
I like the analogy, well, the example of Psalm 1 of the righteous man who meditates on the word day and night and how he's like a planted tree by a stream of living water. But the point being is that he's planted and he bears fruit in due season. He's planted in the word and he'll bear fruit when he needs it.
That's good, man. So we always need to be
So you need to be planted. And any time is a good time to plant yourself in the word. So
That'll preach.
there you go.
So kind of speeding up a little bit, we still felt the Lord's call to the mission field and that things were left undone. So ended up resigning at the Springs Church in that position. And we raised up inside our church, not even with another missions organization, we raised up a long-term team to go back to Southeast Asia because we had lost our original team because of COVID. Everybody kind of went their own ways. And before we did that, we were like, well, they need to be trained theologically in missiology or the study of missions and all of these things. And so we started a mission school inside of our church. And Joe, you and I both taught that.
Yeah.
We basically took all the best that we knew from our previous training and education, and we brought that to these young 20-somethings. There was, 14 of them.
Yep.
And
14.
it was a 40-hour school. Like they had to quit their jobs and like.
I remember it was like 4 hours of teaching every day.
Yeah.
I either would teach 2, you'd teach 2, or I was teaching 4, or you were teaching 4. It was just, it's pretty intense.
Yeah.
And
it was like on biblical worldview, biblical narrative, theology, missiology, missionary character, cultural simulations, like all of these great things that I think that the education that we had gotten previously paid dividends.
we had them try to simulate a squatty potty.
That was a great
And
class.
they had to use their left hand.
Because no one taught us how to do that.
That was a necessary, you know, it's kind of like taxes. It's like no one teaches you how to do your taxes.
Maybe, but someone should.
But it needs to be done, you know, because people grow up and they don't know how to do their taxes.
Or else you're going to pee on your pants.
We need to
in a
know how
foreign
to
nation,
use
and it's
our
going to be the
left
worst day
hand.
of your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we taught, man, we were so kind to those guys.
Yeah.
That was like a 10-month school. All in all, raising support and everything. It took better part of a year and a half, I'd say.
Yeah.
And then we took off to Southeast Asia, same country that we were in before, same city.
Yeah.
And we get there, and long story short, we ended up getting arrested and blacklisted from the country for good reason, for evangelism, and then deported. We got deported from the country, and we wind up back here confused. And so then, at that point, I think that it was like, wow, I don't really have any other plans. I've always wanted to do seminary.
Yeah.
And so by the providence of God, Asbury Theological Seminary had, and I knew of it before we even left to go to the mission field, that they had a satellite campus, a hybrid campus for Asbury in Colorado Springs, in our own hometown. And one of the reasons that Asbury stuck out particularly to me is that there were authors and theologians that had come out of that school that I really appreciated and followed and read their works. And so that was super exciting. I really also appreciated that Asbury had a very non-denominational, I mean, they're Wesleyan, but they have a really great inclusive environment for those of differing denominations. And so I appreciated that. And I also really appreciated just their standards of encouragement of holiness, and that we would be sanctified, not just big brains, but we would walk the walk, not just talk to the talk. But that's why that was some highlights for why I wanted to join Asbury. How about you?
Yeah. Well, like you said, for me too, I also really wanted to do seminary. And in my mind, it was kind of like, I would love to do seminary, but I don't know if it'll ever actually happen. Because one, it's expensive.
Right.
How am I going to pay for it? And two, it's when am I going to find the time to do it? But when we came back, and it was kind of this limbo kind of time where it's like, what do we do now? When seminary came up as an option, and there was other people encouraging me as well to do it, partly because I was already studying so much. It was what I was doing in my free time, I'm like studying first century Second Temple Judaism at a coffee shop, and it's like I could be getting credit for this sort of thing. I could start doing it for seminary, especially if I wanted to teach it later. It's like anyone could say, "Yeah, I spent 4 months studying Greek. Now you need to listen to what I have to say about this Greek verb tense."
Right.
And you're like, "Okay, but how do I know you actually put the work in?" You need someone to validate that, hey, they put in the work, they studied this, so they know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, if I want to teach the Bible later and be taken seriously, then I should pursue.
And that's what one of our elders told us, right? They're like, hey, you're teaching young adults, you're teaching adults in ministry. You need to probably have an education that would equip you to do that.
Yeah.
And we took that to heart. And so I think that's yet another value, is not saying you can't be used by God without a seminary degree, not saying that at all, right? However, if you take very seriously ministry, especially a teaching ministry to adults and children, I mean, I think everybody should be equipped. I forget who it was. I think it may have been Howard Hendricks. He said something to the effect of, would you allow someone who had no medical training, take a scalpel and do heart surgery to you? It's like, no, you never would. And yet that's what we're often doing is like spiritual heart surgery. Like we're putting deep things into people, and we need to be trained and equipped to do that. And so I think we recognized that value and said, yeah, what we have isn't enough. We need to become learners again and really grow in these things.
But they read the book on surgery. They read that book on surgery.
Exactly.
So
that makes
they
them an
obviously know that, and I think that's one also a big value to seminary and higher education is it tests your knowledge. Anyone can pick up a book and read it, and by the end of it they feel like they know the subject,
right?
But until you're tested on it, you don't really know that you know. Other people don't really know.
You only have level 1 knowledge of it, right?
Testing takes you to the whole next level,
an integration
where you've actually applied it, you've really digested it, and you've internalized it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so forth and so on. And you have other people vouching for you too, that's true.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And so we enrolled or began that process, and we were super surprised to find out that there were scholarships available for us. I mean, we're pretty late in the game too. And Asbury,
a month before the semester started.
I know, it was August, and they started in September. And they were like, you know what? We scholarship most of our students. Like 85% get scholarships, and those that don't are mostly because they didn't apply for it. They didn't ask for it.
Yeah.
And so we were like, okay, well, you know, we're just going to trust the Lord that he's going to provide for this. And man, he did. God really used Asbury to provide, because we both have young families with children. And, you know, without that, it would be very, very difficult. And so, again, another value. If you're thinking, man, I really feel like God is calling me to seminary, but I just don't have the finances for it. Maybe your plan is to just save up money and you don't just do it right away. A lot of wisdom in that.
Yeah.
But I also think taking a step of faith and just seeing, you know, you have not because you ask not, and seeing what scholarships are available, or asking your church or whatever, you would be surprised, especially speaking as both of us missionaries, you would be surprised how God provides for those financial means. So don't let that stop you. If you really want to do it, don't let money be the barrier to pursuing seminary.
Yeah, definitely.
The Seminarian is made possible by our sponsor, Asbury Theological Seminary, a multi-denominational graduate school of theology called to teach the unchanging truth of Christianity. I have learned so much from my professors at Asbury, and hey, you can too. Did you know that over 80% of incoming students received scholarships last year, and many students graduate without tuition debt? Discover how Asbury Seminary makes theological education accessible by visiting asburyseminary.edu/seminarian.
In summary, there's been a variety of life events and influences thus far that have brought us to seminary. We so appreciate how God has led us to become seminarians.
Some important values that we learned were knowing the Bible for yourself, gaining exposure to the broader theological world, being inspired to become a role model for others to follow, getting equipped for ministry, and lastly, preparing to be used by God in greater capacities.
But what do you think? Why did you enroll in seminary? Or, if you're not yet in seminary, what reasons do you have for wanting to become a seminarian? Let us know in the comments section of the episode at seminarian.life.
Until next time, thanks for joining the conversation today. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram so that you can stay notified every time we drop a new episode.